the rise of the United States of America as a world power. It found its essence in a group of determined, resourceful, hardworking, and often unscrupulous men who drove that nation to a level of growth that even surpassed its former British mother country. One of the greatest embodiments of these men was John Pierpont Morgan, who rose as the most powerful banker in the history of his country, achieving an unprecedented level of influence over the finances, industry, wallets, and even the culture of an entire nation, and later the world. His skill as a businessman and his immense influence as a pioneer of the business world that would dominate the 20th century. They consolidated the United States as the powerhouse we know today, and they ushered in the era of the great global tycoons and colossal private capitalist monopolies, capable of bending not only the American state but the state of any part of the world. His figure and his legacy are crucial to understanding the American ideal of development and infinite material progress that would pave the way for the United States to become the world's hegemon. Join us to learn about this extraordinary story. This is Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to give us great support by liking this video and leaving your comments. We always read all of them by turning on notifications with the bell, subscribing to the channel, of course, and sharing this material with all your contacts on WhatsApp, on social media, and anywhere else. So without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837 in the city of Hartford, which was the capital of the state of Connecticut, in the region known as New England, in the northeastern United States of America. This was a young nation that amazed the world with the success of its republican and liberal system, in a world that until then was mostly dominated by the ancient European monarchies. On his father's side, Morgan was descended from an old farming family from Wales that had settled in the North American country since the mid-17th century. However, his grandfather, Joseph Morgan, was the first in the family to leave farming to pursue other occupations, mainly trade, thus beginning a long and powerful dynasty of businessmen whose activity would also be inherited by him, the father of our protagonist, Junius Morgan, who entered the world of finance as a merchant banker in New York City, gradually managing to increase his family's wealth. On his mother's side, Morgan's mother, Juliet Pierpont, also comes from an important family of renowned scholars and famous politicians who played a significant role in the American independence process and in American literature. So Morgan grows up in an opulent family environment where the needs of the time were not a problem during his childhood, although he would have some recurring health problems, such as skin diseases, which would prevent him from functioning normally in some aspects. Now then, before moving forward, it's important to talk about that vigorous nation, so revolutionary and rapidly changing, in which Morgan was born. The American nation has its distant origins in the first English settlements on the northeastern coast of the American continent at the beginning of the 17th century. The English, who in Europe were in the midst of a race to expand their limited domains, would transplant their Protestant faith and their mercantile and seafaring spirit to these regions. At the same time, they were almost exterminating and displacing the native population and establishing the famous 13 colonies that stretched from north to south along the east coast of that region. Each of these colonies had a type of government that, although similar, was different and independent from the others. In this way, almost entirely, an environment of customs, traditions, and political principles was created, made in the image and likeness of old Elizabethan England. The American nation and its system are also made in the image and likeness of what has been called the White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or better known by the English acronym WASP. However, Little by little, these colonies begin to develop. In the north, an economy based on trade and industry, and in the south, an economy mostly based on agriculture. And the slave labor brought from Africa, they grow rapidly, both in population and in autonomy, to the point that, finally, after several political and economic disagreements with the British Crown, the so-called Founding Fathers, influenced by the spirit of Enlightenment liberalism and by classical republicanism, most of them also gathered in secret societies such as Freemasonry, are going to declare the independence of those 13 colonies and unite them into a new country called the United States of America. On July 4, 1780, it became a republic, adopting a republican federal constitutional and representative form of government. This quest for autonomy will lead to the so-called American War of Independence, which will pit the supporters of independence against the supporters of the British Crown, lasting until 1783 and ending with the British Crown's recognition of the new nation across the ocean. In this way, as the 18th century ended and the 19th century began, they were already citizens of an independent nation that had inherited the best of commerce, the technology and enlightenment of the English mother country. The leaders of the American nation, with an eye toward expanding their territory, formulated the so-called Manifest Destiny, a religious political doctrine that claimed the United States was a sort of nation, chosen and predestined to expand from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, bringing its values and culture to the rest of the region. And in addition to this, they managed to annex the territory of Mississippi and negotiated with France the purchase of the vast territory of Louisiana in 1803. And from Spain, they also secured the cession of Florida in 1819. However, as we said, the expansion promoted by the ideologues of Manifest Destiny, it was not just a mere territorial expansion, but a true process of cultural, political, and economic consolidation of the population of the United States of America over its new territories. Therefore, over time, Americans began to populate the annexed territories, and they began establishing new settlements, some of which eventually became cities. Eventually, they created new states that joined the Union. This was the historical context in which our protagonist, J.P. Morgan, was born, a time marked by the great imperial nation-building project that was beginning to take shape, and in which Morgan would play no small part. During his youth, Morgan had a rebellious character and was not very diligent in his studies. In fact, he ended up attending 9 schools in Hartford, where he had the habit of climbing trees to court young ladies from the windows of their houses. In the spring of 1850, Morgan's father decided to move the family to the city of Boston to start a new import business. There, in Boston, Morgan, at 13 years old, now dedicated himself seriously to his studies, enrolling in the Episcopal Academy and eventually in Boston English High School. There, he learned languages such as Latin and Greek and broadened his knowledge in various fields. At that time, Morgan developed an interest in finance as well as in arithmetic, keeping track of his income and expenses in a notebook and taking charge of managing the accounts of his father's business. However, Morgan suffered from a painful joint disease that left him with a severe limp, and on medical advice, he had to seek fresh air and new places for his recovery. So towards the end of 1852, at the age of 15, Morgan embarked on his first ocean voyage to the island of Faial in the Azores archipelago in Portugal. There, he was captivated by the port activity on the island, carefully observing and asking the sailors about the commercial dynamism of the ships that docked there. In April 1853, Morgan went to England to reunite with some of his family and accompanied his father to important meetings with bankers in London. Then he began a tour of the rest of Europe, where he managed to catch glimpses of the main monarchs of the old continent at various events. Back in Boston, Morgan finished his high school studies, and at the same time, his father made a key move for both of their lives when he partnered with the London-based firm of the powerful American banker George Peabody, thus forming the firm Peabody Morgan Company. This meant a huge leap for the Morgan family, who were now beginning to build a powerful banking empire. As a result of this new major venture, the family moved to the city of London, and Junius Morgan, the father of our protagonist, would be in charge of managing the business of his partner, George Peabody, who was in the process of retiring. At the same time, Morgan was sent by his father to Switzerland to study, with the aim of eventually, at the age of 18 or 19, enrolling at the University of Göttingen in Germany, with the goal that he would speak German fluently, as well as other foreign languages necessary for international business. In Germany, Morgan would achieve exceptional academic performance, excelling in languages, algebra, and trigonometry. Young Morgan didn't know that all his various academic preparations would come together to bring him great rewards in his future professional life. After finishing his time at university, Morgan meets his father in London, where he formally enters the family business. Thus, he officially began working in the powerful world of finance. That is, in the business of money, the business of creating and managing capital. So in August of 1857, he traveled to New York and established his residence there, working as a representative of his father's firm in the booming and vigorous United States, specifically in the area of short-term commercial financing. When Morgan returned to the United States, the country was facing a major economic crisis as a result of the global downturn known as the Panic of 1857. This crisis marked the end of the economic expansion that had characterized the United States after the gold rush that began in 1848. However, Morgan, already 20 years old, would not be intimidated by this situation, and in a curious episode decided to risk his father's firm's money to buy a shipment of coffee at the port of New Orleans. His prediction was that there would be an abrupt change in the market and in prices that would allow him to resell it quickly at a markup, which he indeed achieved and made a handsome profit. But despite this success, the operation earned him the disapproval of his father's firm, which denied him the possibility of becoming a partner. In rejection of these highly economic practices, the decision also has the support of his father, Junius, who condemns the maneuver for considering it as a usurious behavior. This episode, however, reveals the ambitious and cunning character of the young Morgan. By 1961, Morgan witnesses the violent presidential victory of the renowned Abraham Lincoln, a victory that, as we mentioned previously, comes with an intensification of political and social conflicts in the North American nation. Conflicts that are the result of different visions on how to lead the country in economic, political, social matters, and issues such as slavery. This conflict eventually leads to the secession of the southern states from the American state and the union of these states as a new independent nation under the name of the Confederate States of America, which directly leads to a huge internal conflict without precedent in the history of the United States, known as the American Civil War, which will pit the Unionists against the Confederates. Morgan, for his part, had no desire to go fight in that war, and he managed to avoid being drafted by paying for a substitute to take his place in the army, a practice that became common among the wealthy classes of American society during that time of war. As hostilities continued to develop, Morgan changed his approach to doing business. After the collapse of cotton exports and the decline in railroad construction, faced with this, he decided to fully dedicate himself to the securities business, that is, finance. At the same time, Morgan took advantage of the war situation by lending money to people who bought old rifles from the government and resold them to the Union Army for a huge profit. It was a purely speculative operation that added no value to the economy, especially in a wartime situation, for which the young Morgan was accused. However, he didn't pay any attention to it, even though it ended up being one of the most widely denounced cases of speculation during that war. At that time, Morgan also married his fiancée Amelia Sturgis on October 7, 1861, who also came from a prominent family of merchants from Connecticut. However, Amelia had contracted tuberculosis sometime before the marriage and would die just 4 months later, devastating the spirits of J.P. Morgan, who became a widower at just 25 years old. By September 1862, still stunned by the loss of his wife and also angry because his bosses refused to make him a partner, Morgan decided to found his own firm, where he focused on trading government bonds and currencies, financing commodity trades, and reporting to London on prices and U.S. policy. By October 1864, the firm Peabody Morgan Company was dissolved following the expiration of the partnership. Even so, Morgan's father decided to continue his business with his new trading firm called J.S. Morgan Company, which eventually became an important international banking house. In this way, Junius, J.P. Morgan's father, sought to strengthen his son's firm by including a new and respected business partner, known as Charles Dabney, who, in addition to being a partner, would also serve as J.P. Morgan's mentor to help him perfect his business skills. After this, Morgan eventually decided to dissolve his own firm to fully join his father's company. The economic contraction caused by the Civil War led the Morgan firm to lose money due to capital flight. However, after the victory of the Union forces in 1865, a new era of economic expansion began in the North, an era in which, as we will see later, the Morgans would manage to establish themselves as major international bankers. But going back to the early life of our protagonist, Morgan interrupts his work to marry again, this time to the beautiful Françoise Louisa Tracy, daughter of a prominent Wall Street lawyer and 6 years younger than him. The couple would eventually have 5 children. The couple goes on their honeymoon to Europe, where Morgan takes the opportunity to meet with his father and make new plans for a future that looked very promising for the Morgan dynasty. As we mentioned, after the Civil War, the United States over the next few decades would emerge as a world power through a rapid economic, industrial, and cultural expansion. An era of unprecedented progress, known as the Gilded Age, where the companies and businesses of the nation's leading magnates would also play a fundamental role in the country's destiny. This was also the height of capitalism as a mode of production on a global scale. In this sense, by 1869, Morgan would be a direct witness to this national development, venturing on a journey for the first time to the western part of the country on the newly inaugurated Transcontinental Railroad, a feat of engineering and human labor. It would extend for more than 10,000 kilometers and would revolutionize the economy and human relations of that country. This experience would renew Morgan's interest in investing in the railroad sector, which was booming at the time. So Morgan returns to New York and faces a legal dispute in order to gain control of a railroad that had just been completed in upstate New York. There, Morgan, at 32 years old, surprises many with his legal maneuvers, using a partner's company to acquire the majority of the railroad's shares. And then he calls a shareholders meeting to decide control of the company through a vote. The result will be a victory for Morgan, which will later be ratified by a higher state court. In this way, Morgan satisfies most of the parties involved in the conflict and raises his reputation among the business community as one of the strong men of American banking. As Morgan develops in the railroad sector, he also diversifies his investments into all kinds of profitable businesses. From that time, ranging from cotton and grains to heavy machinery, factories, refineries, and mills. It's worth noting that at that time, the United States operated without a central bank, without a centralized bank that was the only one with the authority to issue currency and regulate credit. So private banks and private bankers, especially in the investment sector, had an almost official capacity to issue currency, that is, to be a monetary issuing entity. This was beginning to spark an important debate in American civil society about the power these big capitalists were accumulating and the level of influence they had over the people's wallets. As Morgan's career was growing, he took his first steps in what would later be called philanthropy, the practice in which great magnates and capitalists invest money not only in their companies, but also in the world of education, property, medicine, food, culture, and science. In Morgan's case, he began by financing the founding of the Museum of Natural History, and later on, the Museum of Art in New York, together with Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who was the father of the future American president. This was one of the first examples of what would later become the fusion between big capital and the world of culture and academia, embodied in figures such as the Rockefeller Foundation, and later on, various billionaires up to the present day. In the midst of all this, in 1971, there was the sudden departure of his business partner and mentor, Charles Dabney, from the trading company. This leads Morgan to consider leaving the financial business. However, with his father's intervention, Morgan decides instead to create a new firm, this time in partnership with a man named Anthony Joseph Drexel, who was a prominent international banker from Philadelphia, whose operational base was in Paris. In the midst of this great debate about banking and monetary issues in the United States, in 1873, the Treasury Department of that country asked Morgan to create a syndicate of investors to help the federal government replace $300 million. Dollars in high-interest Civil War bonds, which the federal government issued during the war to citizens to raise funds, would be replaced with new lower-interest bonds. These will be restricted.
Emitidos que pagaran una tasa de interés más baja. Esta va a ser la primera prueba del poder.
This new syndicate, created to replace them, reflected the influence Morgan had been amassing over the U.S. government. What was being said back then? It was that the shortage of capital and monetary liquidity at the time, compared to the debts that existed, threatened to trigger a domino effect of debts that could lead to a severe economic depression. The fear among the population of losing their savings in the event of a banking collapse was something palpable and discussed daily. Thus, in that year, 1873, this led to a massive withdrawal of funds from the banks, further worsening the crisis. Faced with the federal government's inability to deal with this financial situation, it found itself needing to turn to prominent bankers like Morgan to address the issue. During this crisis, Morgan's intelligence and cunning stood out above the other bankers. He managed to maneuver and establish himself in a role similar to that of a central bank at that time, organizing loans and importing money from England to inject capital in the face of the recession. Eventually, in this scenario of economic decline, the so-called Panic of 1873 occurred, the much-feared collapse in which, faced with a massive withdrawal of capital by the savers from these banks, they became insolvent and unable to meet their obligations, causing not only the collapse of banks, but also the collapse of companies and massive layoffs, and exposing what some have called and considered the first systemic crisis of global capitalism. Beyond the economic crisis, the truth is that, as we mentioned, Morgan actually knew how to take advantage of it to increase his wealth and further consolidate his position in global banking. And not only that, but in the United States, he was finally consolidating himself as one of the most important figures in the financial world. So in the following years, Morgan would move his investments with extreme caution due to the volatility of the time. Meanwhile, he became stubborn and methodical in his work. He used to avoid interviews and hated having his picture taken due to his particular skin condition from acne, which in earlier times had even deformed his nose. Morgan, modest by nature, was not like the vast majority of magnates of the time, who used to build mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York and organize big parties. However, Morgan did interact easily with powerful businessmen in the most prestigious clubs in the country. At 40 years old, Morgan was a man with a fierce and burly appearance, gray hair, and a handlebar mustache. He was a man who had suffered and would continue to suffer several depressive episodes due to the loss of his first wife and overwork. In fact, his second marriage would not be very fruitful emotionally, as the couple would remain distant for the rest of their lives, keeping up appearances. But they were emotionally distant, since a divorce would be very counterproductive for his social status in the business world of that time. A time that would also continue to bring surprises for the now established banker, John Pierpont Morgan. Well, in the near future, J.P. Morgan will not only rise within American history, but he will become the embodiment of a new economic and social system in the world, a new way of life, and a new way of doing things from within power and the business world. You can find the second part of this extraordinary story on our channel. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I remind you that you give us a big boost and a great help by interacting with the channel, leaving your comments, liking the videos, sharing the content on social media, on WhatsApp, and in any other space, and by activating the bell so you get notifications every time we publish new content. So thank you all again, and may God bless you.